here, right now, right here, right now, right here, right now, right here.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Cristo Putting the World Right. Lots for us to discuss this week, and I'm thrilled to be doing so with the political commentator Albie Amankona. Hello, Albie.
Hello, Cristo.
What are you, Albie?
What am I? I mean, what an interesting question. I wear a couple of different hats. So I suppose in the media world, I do a bit of broadcasting, both for television and radio. I also have a job in the city as a financial analyst, mostly looking at telecoms and media companies. I've been doing that basically since I graduated from university. And then I have a position in the Conservative Party as the vice chair of the LGBT plus Conservatives. So a couple of different things that I do that might be interesting today.
The LGBT Conservatives?
Yes. You've got a bone to pick with us, I believe, Cristo. Is that right?
Now, those who will look back at episodes of this will remember I spoke to Charlie Rowley a few weeks ago, and he reminded me of the time when we were at conference and we arrived at the LGBT Tory party, which was the actual, big after party in this bar in a place called Birmingham, and got to the door. And you'd very kindly put me on the list on the door, but I got to the door and they were like, "Oh, yeah, there's been a bit of confusion. You're not in, but Charlie, you're okay. You can go in." And literally before she'd even finished the sentence, Charlie was gone. He was gone. and she said, "Oh, don't worry, he'll be in 5 minutes." So I was left at the door, and then I went to the VIP area, which Charlie was in, quaffing, champagne, and I saw you. And you very kindly came over and said, "Why aren't you in here?" And I was like, "Oh, there's been a confusion. They won't let me in." And then you very kindly spoke to the gentleman who I think has just got a New Year's honour, actually, who was on the door of the VIP area. And you said, "Oh, this is Cristo. You've got to let him in." And honestly, that man should be running the border force, because he was like, "No, absolutely not." And you were like, "But come on, let him in." "No, absolutely not." And the more it went on, the more I realised that I was stood outside the VIP area and I could see all the people, and it was starting to get a bit tragic. But so thank you for your endeavours and your attempts to get me in, Albie.
Yes, sorry about that, Cristo. Well, I do recall we were both at a TikTok drinks party before, and I said, "I'm going to leave now and go to this LGBT plus Conservatives party. Do you want to come with me?" And I think if you'd have come with me, Cristo, you'd have been in the VIP area, because if you'd come in with me, I would have got you in there and then. But I think by the time that it all happened, you weren't on the list for whatever reason, and then it was too late because the area was too full. So the moral of the story is, follow Albie.
That is true. But what was happening was I was a very trendy, what was it, TikTok part. I'm very trendy, Albie. That's the problem.
Are you on TikTok, Cristo?
I am on TikTok, actually. I'm at Cristo_radio. And so I've just started putting some of these videos on TikTok, but I'm very trendy at this TikTok party, and that was why I said, it was with you, wasn't it, that you and I were looking for the TikTok party?
Yeah.
I was wandering down the back streets of Birmingham looking for this venue.
It was in a really odd venue. It was by, like, in a corner of some arena, it looked like, and we walked all the way the other side of the arena, which was completely wrong. We thought, well, there's nothing happening here. And then I think it was you who found where the actual party was, but it ended up being quite a good party. I think Peter Andre was there, but I think we missed him. There were lovely canapes and lots to drink. So I think I'm glad that we went.
Was the party better because we missed Peter Andre, do you think? That wrong?
I couldn't possibly comment, Cristo. You might very well think that.
Now, I've just noticed my little on-air light isn't on. Hang on. I'm going to put it on. Because otherwise... Oh, there. See, that makes the world of difference, doesn't it?
I'm so glad you did that. I don't know what we would have done if that wasn't on, to be honest.
Are you being sarky twatty, Albie?
I don't know what you're talking about, Cristo. I just think it makes such a huge difference with it on. And all the people listening to the podcast... You
can't see it properly now that it's on.
No, it's almost too bright.
It's too bright, isn't it? Shall I turn it back off?
No, Cristo, leave it on. You've made all the effort now.
I forgot that I know when you're being sarcastic because your mouth's moving. I forgot that rule when I was talking to you. I remember it now. The way I know that you're being sarcastic and cutting is simply that your mouth is moving. Okay, So, lots we're going to talk about. Do like and subscribe, as always. I've got to keep reminding you to do that. Hello to everyone who's watching. Apparently, I've got quite a big audience in the US and Australia, Albie.
Gosh,
Who knew? I'm big in
international.
Australia and I'm big in the US.
You're big in the UK too, Cristo.
Thank you. I think that the answer to that is I'm just big. But thank you to all of you who are watching there and all of you who comment from those far-flung destinations of the world. So, talking of far-flung destinations, we will, of course, talk about the inauguration and some of the Trump hysteria that's taken place and the speech that he gave during the inauguration. We're going to talk about Southport, actually, and this alleged cover-up, and whether you were convinced by what Keir Starmer had to say in his speech about that when he took media questions. And, of course, Prince Harry has settled in his case as well against the Sun newspaper. He's got a full and unreserved apology and a massive wad of cash, despite previously denying that he would take any cash because he wanted to go to court. And so we'll be talking about that and any other business as well. Anything else you want to talk about, Albie?
No, I think that is a brilliant agenda.
Thank you, Albie. I can tell. Oh, you can tell he's in politics, can't you? So shall we start with the inauguration? Because I love Donald Trump's speeches now. I've started to warm to him more this time. I used to think he was kind of unhinged, but I did find myself watching it and appreciating, although I didn't agree with everything he might have said or the kind of sledgehammer way in which he delivers, there isn't a lot of nuance in anything he says. I did find myself a little bit jealous of just having that strong leader that seems to want to put the interests of the country first, whether you agree or disagree with the methodology he might have to do that. Was that how you felt? Did you feel the same way?
I felt a similar way. I think looking at this speech as someone in Britain, one of the most striking things about it was just how optimistic it was. You know, the leader of the free world, the president of the American people, saying in his first speech to the American people, the golden age starts now. I can't remember a time in my entire lifetime where a political leader in the United Kingdom has made such a positive speech. Theresa May certainly didn't. I don't even really think Boris Johnson did. Rishi Sunak certainly didn't. Keir Starmer absolutely hasn't. If anything, he's done the complete opposite. So I actually felt, as a Brit, a little bit jealous that there was a leader who was talking about their country in such positive terms and in a way that they really wanted to turn the country around in a way that was going to make a difference to the lives of everyday people. Now, whether or not Donald Trump is actually going to be able to do that in his term is another question. Of course, he can only be in term. He's got one term, essentially can't do a second term because of the way the American rules work. So it'll be interesting to see what he's able to do in this term. But it was certainly an ambitious speech, a positive speech, and I wish we had more of that in Britain and Europe, because it's quite depressing here at the moment.
You're right. What Trump has got, again, we can get into the nuts and bolts about the parts we might agree with or disagree with, but he does understand that a part of politics is being a showman for any politician, and you've got to give a bit of oomph. You've got to give a bit of a party. You've got to give a bit of positivity. I would say that the closest we have had to that in recent years is Boris Johnson. You know, he was sort of very much like sunny up plans, wasn't he? You know, levelling up, all of this stuff. The problem is it was all based on absolute nonsense. But you cannot do down Boris Johnson's positivity and the fact that he was relentlessly positive. And I think sometimes there's methodology to that, although it can be frustrating that you want some, I guess, substance from those leaders that are relentlessly positive. There is method to it, because actually the markets respond to things like that. People who want to trade with the country respond to things like that. And to your point about what we've had here in the UK, you're quite right that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves especially, they've pointed out all the things that seem to be wrong with what's going on in the UK, but there's been absolutely no positivity, to the point where the markets in the run-up to the budget were like, well, no point investing in the UK. Businesses weren't expanding. People have been laying off staff because all they've done is been absolute doomsayers of misery from the moment they've been elected.
Yes, and we've seen that consumer confidence is down. Businesses are changing their plans, their hiring plans for the next 12 to 24 months. Labour like to boast about all of this investment that they've been able to achieve for the UK, but actually most of that was achieved under the last Conservative government. So I think there is probably something that we in Britain can learn from Donald Trump. But just to come back on the comparison between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, of course, Boris Johnson was a very positive politician, but then when it came to backing that up with actual policies that were going to improve things, it was very thin. A lot of the things that Conservatives are quite angry about now, high levels of immigration, high levels of taxation, the planning system that we have in this country, stifling investment, stifling growth, a lot of that was caused by Boris Johnson. He made all of these promises, of course, to level up, to reform the planning system so we could build things more quickly, to build high-speed rail links across the north. But he never actually got around to doing it, even though he had that massive majority. So I think there are a lot of Conservatives in the UK who feel quite angry about Boris Johnson's last period in government. And I sincerely hope for the people of the United States that Donald Trump doesn't make the same mistakes, although it does seem like this time he's really hit the ground running. I think he signed a record number of executive orders on his first day now. They're not all legally binding, but it certainly shows a declaration of intent to get moving quickly. Donald Trump seems to be, to me, a man on a hurry.
Yeah, well, there was substance. I'm going to do this. I am going to do that. And it's stuff that he's started. I mean, I was never a fan of Boris Johnson. I absolutely, I loathed him as a prime minister and a leader of this country. He was absolutely dreadful. And the problem I've always said with him, and I'll say it again, is that you can be that showman, and I think it's important to have a little bit of showbiz in being a politician, just to spark just a bit of it. Like Blair had it in droves. In fact, it was oozing out of him. But you've got to have some sort of ideological direction on which everything falls back on. And I couldn't tell you what Johnsonism is in a million years. I feel a bit the same about Starmer, actually. I don't know what Starmerism actually is other than abject misery, it seems, for everyone. But we ended up with Boris Johnson during COVID, and because he had no ideological belief in anything, all of the COVID decisions were very reactive rather than following a direction of travel. So if you look at a politician like Thatcher, for instance, and I think we might have had this conversation before, Thatcher's entire ideology was small state, personal freedom. So if she had been reacting to COVID, firstly, those scientists, Chris Whitty and everyone, they would have had the hairdryer treatment, and there would have been no way that they would have left any of those rooms after meetings with Thatcher without having to have gone through their data backwards, forwards, upwards, downwards, and a million times over to have been scrutinised. But secondly, then the decisions made about the reaction to COVID would have all come from the ideological reference of the state being small and people's personal freedoms as far as possible within the crisis having to be maintained. And all decisions would have fallen from that framework. Whereas Johnson is the kind of leader that just agrees with everyone in front of him. He just nods to the person in front of him. That person says you've got to shut schools. Oh, yes, I should shut schools. That person said you should let it rip through the community and let people die and the bodies pile up. Oh, okay, yes, I agree with you. Oh, and we should reopen schools. Oh, yes, I agree with you. And because of that, we just ended up with this complete mishmash of just nonsense when we really needed an ideological backbone during that period.
I agree to some degree, but I don't want to poo-poo Boris Johnson's COVID response too much. I mean, in terms of similarly sized European countries and economies, the UK was neither exceptionally good nor exceptionally bad when it came to managing the pandemic. Now, that's not a good thing. That's not a bad thing. But I don't want to sit here and say that everything that Boris Johnson did when he was a prime minister, especially during the pandemic, was bad. I think what he did with the vaccine rollout, for example, was an example of him actually perhaps using some of his ingenuity. Maybe he didn't use that ingenuity enough. But to come back to Donald Trump, he's only got a 4-year term to be the president of the United States of America. He's promised a lot of things. I think in a 12 to 24 month time period before the midterms, he's going to have demonstrated how he has improved things for the American people. I mean, it's all well and good to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, but what is that actually doing to improve the lives of American people? So I want to see the substance of what he's doing. I think he's made some good starts, especially with some of the DEI stuff that he is putting on hold quite valiantly. I think he's putting lots of people on leave with a view to actually just get rid of a lot of those functions from state departments completely relatively soon, which I think is something quite refreshing, something which is done on day one. I couldn't imagine a British Prime Minister ever being able to do something so quickly. So I think he started on that quite well. But the real question will be on the economy and whether or not the American people feel richer in a 12 or 24 month period under Trump than they did under Biden. And what we've also got to remember about the American economy is that actually during the period of Biden, the American economy was growing a lot faster than it's growing in Europe. I think a lot of European countries would give an arm and a leg to have the levels of economic growth that America has. So to think that Americans are feeling unhappy with their economy, even though they've been having levels of growth that we would dream of in Europe, I think actually makes Trump's job harder.
Well, it's similar to what we had here in the UK, where in the early 2000s our economy was absolutely booming and doing well, but was it actually being, was it doing well on paper, but was it actually being felt by those people who are probably the lowest in the socio-economic terms on the ground? Was it getting through to them? Because we can all look back at those periods of when we had high immigration and an economy that was really growing when it came to GDP, but GDP means nothing to someone on the ground whose wages haven't gone up and who can't get basic hospital appointments or infrastructure. And so I wonder if that's what America is facing at the moment.
Possibly. I mean, wage stagnation and a lot of the issues that we've had in the UK when it comes to the economy, whether or not it was things like quantitative easing. These are all things that were almost in low levels of growth. These are all things that were almost in response to the 2008 financial crisis. Actually, pre the 2008 financial crisis, even though it was almost on a credit bubble, you might argue. Real wages were going up. Satisfaction with the NHS was actually, generally speaking, quite high. Education could have been better, but generally speaking, people felt that public services were working. This is back in the early 2000s. Now, of course, this is from what I read, Cristo. I can't really remember those days very much, and this is what my mother tells me about it. But my general feeling is that pre the 2008 crisis, even though it was on a credit bubble, if you will, things were going all right for the United Kingdom. And if you look at the trend of growth from 2008, really, the preceding 10, 20, 30 years, there's not huge changes. If there was any economic difficulties, we're able to get back to that sort of 2-3% level of GDP growth year on year. But after 2008, after the 2008 financial crisis, that has been literally impossible for almost any European country to achieve. Why is it that we've been unable in Europe to get back to the early to mid noughties levels of economic GDP growth? What is it? Is it the regulatory framework that we've inherited because of things like environmental regulation, because of things like DEI more recently? Is it because of that? Is it because we're lazier? Is it because we've got an aging population and a shrinking labour force? Is it because we're less productive? There's all of these questions because actually at the turn of the century, the British economy and the American economy were pretty similar. But America has really pulled away over the last 25 years from Europe in terms of GDP growth, whereas Europe really has stagnated since 2008, and we need to figure out why that is.
I mean, I'm just trying to look at what happened with pay in sort of 2000 onwards, because I don't know, income distribution, and because I accept that our economy was growing during that time, But the problem is that I think that a lot of people who were at the very bottom of society weren't seeing those improvements to GDP, and um, that even if wages were going up anyway, and even if they were going up marginally, due to the number of people that we have in the United Kingdom, and due to the fact that we were importing a lot of the labour force, and due to the fact that we had countries ascending to the European Union that were allowing us to have more people come here, like Bulgaria and Romania, where we ended up with, I think, 2 million more people. Um, Even if you are getting a rise in wages, that's not going to offset the rise in costs that comes from more people coming to a country, meaning that you've got higher housing costs, meaning that you've got the cost of not being able to have access to the infrastructure because there are more people using it. So, although I agree on paper, it looked like people were doing better in the early 2000s. For those people that weren't, I think that's exactly what drove Brexit and why we ended up then after the financial crash. Those people who had not felt the benefits before 2008, then there was a financial crash that caused austerity, which again, which meant people voted for austerity, which meant that people then still didn't get any of the benefits. I think that's why we ended up with Brexit.
I'm not sure Brexit would have happened if we'd have continued on the GDP growth trajectory that we saw before 2008. I think Brexit was, and also, of course, there was the problem of Blair letting all of the eastern countries that joined the European Union in the mid 2000s. There was the problem of that immigration, but in terms of that real anger and feeling that things had not improved in the country, generally speaking, at least from what I understand, that came from stagnation after the 2008 financial crash. We've got to remember that leaving the EU is not a new idea. People have wanted to leave the EU for a very long time. There was the referendum party, of course, in 1997, run by was it Jimmy Goldsmith? Is that his name? Not Jimmy Goldsmith. What's his name? I've made that up. What's he called?
No,
Yes,
hang on.
is it Jimmy Goldsmith? I think it is Jimmy Goldsmith. Hold on.
I'm looking it up for you.
Yes, Jimmy Goldsmith.
It
Sir
was
James
Jimmy
Goldsmith.
Goldsmith.
Yes, there was a
James
referendum
Goldsmith, that's right, yeah.
party. There was the referendum party, which was quite big in the late 90s, early noughties, which was a party that was all about leaving the European Union, but no one voted to leave. I think Priti Patel was a leading light in that party at that time. Leaving the European Union is not a new idea, but it only gained traction after the 2008 financial crash, and people were feeling that things just had not improved for them in the way that they had become accustomed to in the pre-2008 way. But we're talking about ancient history now. Even Brexit feels like a topic I think we need to move on from. But I just hope that Donald Trump doesn't fall into the same mistakes that Boris Johnson did when Boris Johnson became the Prime Minister.
Just one final point on that, because I do think it set the groundwork for exactly where we are today. Was so interestingly, when the 2008 financial crash happened, and you're quite right, we'd all been in a credit bubble before then. I mean, as you know, I'm a buy-to-let landlord. I remember being able to buy properties then with a 10% deposit, and they would, all I'd need was a letter from my accountant to say he can afford it. That would be it. I'd get the mortgage. I mean, looking back on it now, it was so easy. Luckily, I mean, I was quite financially savvy and always made sure that the rent would cover the mortgage and all of these sorts of things. But looking back on it, had I not been a bit of a scaredy cat, I could have borrowed so much more money and got properties that were way beyond my reach, because it was easy to do that. Of course, so it was all a house of cards. We then ended up with a crash, which should have been predicted, really. We didn't have money in the coffers in order to sustain and be able to cushion that crash. Then in 2010, people voted, as they'd had in 1979, for a party that had in its manifesto that it would cut public spending. It was the only two times in history that we voted for parties that have said that they will essentially bring in austerity. At the time, the IMF were talking about Britain's credit rating, and I remember very distinctly Christine Lagarde being interviewed in a press conference saying, my God, I dread to think where Britain's credit rating would be if it weren't for them bringing in austerity. And they're sort of shaking her head and sort of doing deep intakes of breath. However, a lot of economists now, and indeed I think the IMF itself, looks back on that period and thinks that actually we shouldn't have been austere. We should have perhaps gone down the Gordon Brown route of spending our way out of the crisis that we were in by spending money on infrastructure, by spending government money, by borrowing money for those sorts of projects to get the economy moving. Bearing in mind that the economy has pretty much stagnated since austerity, was that the wrong decision? Was the IMF wrong to back us on austerity? Was it wrong to not spend our way out of that period?
I think it's very easy to look back at historical periods with hindsight and say, well, wouldn't it be better if we did this? Now, of course, there is a perfectly reasonable argument that people on the left and also the right will make. That is that in a period where interest rates were 0 to 0.5%, why wouldn't we just borrow to invest when money was so cheap? Why wouldn't we do that and grow our economy by investing in it? Now, that is an argument, a perfectly reasonable economic argument for someone to make. Now, someone who was in favour of austerity would say, well, if we borrow money today, that is essentially a tax on our children and grandchildren. And as soon as interest rates go up, the cost of servicing that debt goes up, which means that we end up with situations where we're spending more money on servicing debt than we are on some government departments. And how is that right? So I think
Which
it's
we
very
are now, by the way, because of the debt from COVID.
Exactly.
But
We are
go
doing
on.
that right now at this very point in time. So I think it's very easy to look back at points and say, well, shouldn't we have done this? Shouldn't we have done that? I think if we take the IMF's flip flopping on it, as you've just mentioned, I think it actually just illustrates my point perfectly. I think what governments, especially in Europe, need to be looking at are cash flow neutral or cheap/free ways of spurring economic growth. What does that mean? It means regulatory reform mostly, and regulatory reform is not a sexy topic to talk about. We sort of got this weird attitude in Europe where we think we can just add all these regulations onto the things that we care about, in inverted commas, like the environment and D&I and things like that, and we think that has no cost. But then when the UK ends up having the highest energy costs, or some of the highest energy costs per capita in the G7, and that means that manufacturing isn't affordable in the UK, and things like steel plants are closing down, and it's too expensive to heat our homes. We've got all of these things that we've got to pay for because of high energy costs, and actually the cost of everything is linked to the energy costs. All of a sudden, all of those regulations that we think, oh, it doesn't really matter about that little regulation to pay for this subsidy for that, they all start to add up and they have a cumulative effect. And I think there are plenty of cash flow neutral ways that Britain, and actually more broadly Europe as a continent, can look at regulatory reform to spur economic growth.
And those lessons obviously absolutely apply today, because at the moment, and you're right, it doesn't need to be huge amounts of money spent, but at the moment, certainly, as something of an entrepreneur myself, as well as being a journalist, I feel absolutely that there is no incentive whatsoever at the moment to want to start a business or want to be entrepreneurial. You don't need to spend a fortune to incentivize people. You can incentivize people through tax breaks. You can incentivize people in ways that don't cost an awful lot of money. Whereas at the moment, and this goes back to where we started actually, about the climate that has been the mood that has been set by the government, when you also come into power talking everything down, talking about how grim it all is, talking about how you're going to have a budget that is going to harm situations, going to be tough on everyone, talking about all of that stuff. Even if you are of the mindset of someone that might want to start a business that would put money into the economy, why would you? You just think, well, this is the worst possible time. So it is also... So it does take us back to where we started with Trump, really, and the fact that you've got to show some aspiration. You've got to show your people that aspiration works. even if it is as grim as possible, even if you've got to set out how grim it is, you've got to show them that that is something, that is the climate that you are creating. Otherwise, you just end up in this doom cycle.
Yes, and there's got to be a story behind what politicians are doing. So even if there are difficult decisions that are being taken, there's got to be a broader story. And I think one of the reasons why David Cameron and George Osborne were able to win in 2010, even though they were promising austerity, is because they had a broader story. They had a plan to get us to a budget surplus by 2020. I should know it's one of the reasons why I voted Tory in 2015. In fact, they seemed to have a grand plan of where they wanted things to go. Obviously, we're not in a budget surplus; that didn't happen. But the point is, they had a story to tell, and we're not really getting that from Keir Starmer at the moment. Tony Blair had a story to tell. He was bringing people with him. When we think of the great politicians of our time, we think of the story that they wanted to tell and how many of the chapters they were able to get through in their premierships. And I'm not really sure what Keir Starmer's story is, and I don't even think we finished chapter 1 yet.
No, and I have no idea what Starmerism is at the moment, other than absolute sort of misery, monotone misery. That's what I call Starmerism at the moment, because there doesn't seem to be any plan. But of course, what we have had from Starmer this week is this denial of being a part of a cover-up, as is being described here, regarding the Southport attacks, these horrific Southport attacks that took place. He faced questions at a press conference about what he knew about the attacker. I'm not going to name the attacker because I think he's been named enough. Of course, this attacker was apparently found now, we find out, with a knife, something in the region of about 10 times previously. His father had attempted to stop him going out and carrying out a terror attack before. But the biggest accusation of a cover-up is that there was a narrative put out that it was not terror-related. But of course, there are terror-related elements to what he was subsequently charged with. Now, of course, he's pleaded guilty to all of those crimes since, and he's going to be sentenced, I think, in the next day or so. So what do you think? Do you have sympathy for the tightrope that the government would have had during this period of not prejudicing a trial, and the police and CPS not wanting these terror elements to be put out there because the trial could be prejudiced? Or are those accusations of a cover-up valid?
Well, I think, first of all, Cristo, as I like to say with this story, is that, first of all, we've got to remember that on that awful day, 3 young girls were killed: BB King, Elsie Dot Stankham, and Alice de Silva Aguiar. And these
thank
young,
you for doing that. Thank you for naming them.
I mean, I just think it's important that we actually remember that happened, and those names need to be remembered. And whatever the political discussions we have about what Keir Starmer knew and when, and how awful the awful perpetrator is, and terrorist, I will call him a terrorist, is that took part in these attacks and caused this misery for families across the country, and then the racist riots that happened afterwards, that happened as a direct result of that man's actions. The amount of pain that this person has caused has got to be remembered, and the real human impact of that will impact people across this country for generations to come. And I think we've got to remember that. Now, to answer your question directly on how the situation was dealt with after the attack, I think we've got to remember there were lots of wild conspiracy theories going on at the time about the young man that took part in these attacks being some sort of failed asylum seeker, which of course he wasn't. This is the son of some Rwandan refugees, from what we understand from what the reporting is saying. Obviously, this is a young black man. A Muslim name was going around at the time, so there was a lot of misinformation going around at the time. Now, you could argue that one of the reasons why that misinformation was going around was because a vacuum had been created. If I think back to some other recent terrorist attacks. I think of the murder of Joe Cox. I think we knew the details of that quite quickly afterwards. There were pictures of the person who had killed Joe Cox with that. I think it was a makeshift pistol that he had made. We knew that was a form of far right lone wolf terrorism at the time. That was just before Brexit, if I remember correctly. So there was no information vacuum. We all knew everything about what was going on very quickly, and there were no conspiracy theories really going around. I think back to when we also had some of those attacks in places like London Bridge. I think the perpetrators of that and the reasons that happened and it being labelled as terrorism was something that was done quite quickly. So again, there wasn't that information vacuum and all of these wild conspiracy theories flying around. The Manchester Arena attacks, for example. So I think when there are information vacuums, it creates this environment where conspiracy theories can thrive, and all of this accusation of a cover-up is given more credence. Now, do I think someone deliberately sought out to cover up what happened in Southport? No, I don't think that. But I think processes that were followed in other cases that were perhaps not followed in this case were not followed closely enough. And I don't know what the reason for that is. I don't know why there was that sensitivity that was for this case, that there certainly haven't been for other cases of terror that I can remember.
And I think that's a very, very fair point. I think what the frustration for people is that what they have seen happen with other attacks, where it has been, as you rightly point out, labelled as terror immediately, did not happen in this attack. And so they're finding it difficult to understand why, in this particular attack, it would have, according to the CPS, prejudiced any trial. And
Yeah.
you know, as journalists, we're quite used to certain things not being in the public domain, because although it might loathe us that someone who has carried out something so repellent should have a fair trial, and that you're thinking about their rights, you need to have that. It's so essential, because otherwise they have reason to have their charges thrown out. So you've got to be extremely careful when you're looking at certain cases, and contempt of court is something as to why when charges have been brought, you've got to just stick to facts of the case. And you're quite right, there have been precedents set before where it has been a terror attack and it has been called a terror attack immediately. Now the issue is that also sometimes in those attacks that you've spoken about, the perpetrators have been dead. So therefore there hasn't had to be that due process, because you know there won't be a trial. But in other cases they haven't been dead, but it has been very clear that it was a terror attack, because it's reached the threshold of what a terror attack actually is, and they are being charged with offences that are related to that. Now, what appears to be the problem with this case is that initially he was charged with counts of murder and without a terror element to it, but then subsequently, upon searching this person's house over a number of weeks, because ricin was found, and you can't go into the house again and again and keep searching when there's been ricin found, they were continuing the investigation, and then he was essentially charged with the possession of information likely to be useful for terrorism, and this possession of this ricin. Now that didn't happen until October. However, he was not charged with preparing for acts of terrorism, because he didn't reach the threshold for having a political ideology behind what he had done to these girls. Now, so I'm loath to give sympathy for the way it's been handled, because I do think it's been handled badly. But if he wasn't being charged with an actual act of terrorism based on an ideological belief that drove him, then I can see why the CPS would have said, well, look, if we had discussed that earlier, it would have prejudiced the murder charges, because it would have given a motive the moment we can't tie directly to a terrorist ideology. I think the real question is about what the threshold therefore is for a terrorist ideology, because if you're found I think the other thing, as well as the comparisons that you've spoken about, that will make people very confused, and I understand this confusion, is, well, hang on, if you're found then with ricin and you've got an Al Qaeda handbook, why isn't that enough for it to be tied to an actual terrorist ideology and a terrorism motivation? Because he was only charged with, like I said, possession of this terrorist material, rather than it being linked to it being the ideology that drove him to carry out these attacks. And that I can't get my head around. Does that all make sense?
It does make complete sense, and I think people will just be wondering how, in these other situations that I outlined before, the authorities and the media were very quick to label it terrorism. But in this case, even now, people have difficulty calling it terrorism. Keir Starmer spoke about the act of terror that this young man did as a new type of terrorism, of people being radicalized online, of lone wolf terrorism, like this is some sort of completely new phenomenon. I don't think lone wolf terrorism is a completely new phenomenon at all. I
No,
don't
it's
think
not.
people being radicalized by things they see online is a completely new phenomenon. If we look at Prevent, which of course is the one of the counter-terror mechanisms that we have in the United Kingdom, I think the young man that took part in this attack was flagged multiple times through Prevent. He had multiple contacts with various levers of the state, whether or not it was the police, whether or not it was being excluded from school, whether or not it was even his parents stopping him from going out one time when he called up a taxi company. I think it was allegedly to his old school. He used the name Simon and he wanted to go to his old school. Who knows what he wanted to do? And his parents stopped him from doing that. And we hear on the day that this happened, he allegedly rang up the same taxi company, used the name Simon, and got it to where this Taylor Swift dance concert was taking place. So there were so many chances for people, whether or not that is family, which I think we can probably blame a little bit less for this, and the state, where there were interactions with this young man where it seems that not very much was done.
I absolutely agree. And that is the part that I can't get my head around, whether it's a cover up or not, but how I can't get my head around how it can be that you can have you can be charged with the production of a biological weapon after having been previously charged with the murder and the attempted murder of all of these poor people, and also be charged with possession of information likely to be useful for terrorism, but then it not be considered an act based on a terrorist ideology. That is the bit that has led to the worry about prejudice. And I don't understand how what the distinction is. Maybe I don't know enough about the case, but I don't understand what the distinction is, because if you've just gone and killed loads of people after having been referred to Prevent with an Al Qaeda manual in your house and a load of ricin that you've produced, what is the threshold for calling someone a terrorist? If that isn't it, I don't understand what the threshold would be for it to then be based on a terrorist ideology. And I think it is that is making people say, well, hang on, how is this not a cover up? So I think we need to know more about that, and we need to know what that threshold is and why the threshold of this is different to other cases. Because you're right, there have been loads of lone wolf incidents where people have gone out. I think the London Bridge attacker was sorry, the Westminster Bridge attacker was a lone wolf. I know when there were stabbings at Streatham, it was a lone wolf. Why is that different to what has happened here? And that isn't me saying there's been a cover-up, but certainly I don't think we're, as a nation, or many of us, are satisfied with the way in which it's being handled and the way in which the information is being conveyed to us.
Also, to zoom out from this, we can have a sort of media personality debate about whether or not it should be considered terrorism or not. Ultimately, the outcome of this is that 3 people were killed. There were large-scale riots afterwards. Many more were injured. Many more have mental health disorders. So we can have this almost academic debate about whether or not it's terrorism or not. But I think the bigger question is is with the authorities that could have and should have done more to prevent this situation from happening. And I think the government's response to it, let's make it more difficult to buy knives on Amazon, and him being called the Amazon killer on the front of newspapers is absolutely preposterous. I mean, what if he just got this knife from his parents' kitchen drawer, or a knife from the kitchen? This was a kitchen knife. This wasn't a machete. These are things that are easily obtainable by anyone. So I don't think by making it a little bit harder to buy a knife on Amazon because you're going to put an age verification thing there, that's not going to stop 17-year-olds or 16-year-olds getting access to their parents' knives in kitchens. Otherwise, I'm sure there'd be absolutely no knife crime in London by now if it was so easy. And I suppose there's a bigger question about how we have ended up with a culture in the UK where these incidents of knife crime, whether they're terrorist or not, just seem to be happening more and more often. I was just listening to the news earlier, Cristo, today, listening about how I think a 12-year-old has recently been killed in a knife attack somewhere in the country. So zooming out away from this specific case, we have a problem with knife crime in this country, whether it's terror-related or non-terror-related. And I don't think any government, whether it's a Conservative government or a Labour government, is doing enough to counter that. And I don't think making it harder to buy knives on Amazon is going to touch the sides.
One final point on this. I do think that it also speaks to the style of leader Keir Starmer is, because now, knowing what we know now and knowing that he knew it then, when the riots took place, no one rioting was a good thing. Of course, it's absolutely awful that people were rioting and being violent and targeting ethnic minorities on the street. It's repellent. It's awful. But I wonder if Keir Starmer could have, in his style of addressing the nation when that had been taking place, have just been a little bit more reassuring to the nation, rather than just calling everyone that had concerns far right. Of course, some of them were, but anyone that looked at this case, I just wonder whether, again, that a lot of the trouble in this could have been prevented, not necessarily by giving the information out that the CPS told people to keep quiet, but just by actually Keir Starmer having a little bit of humility and saying, you know what, I do understand why you're worried about this, and I do understand what's going on, and I do understand why you feel like this was the right course of action, but it isn't. And we got none of that from him. And again, it goes back to where we started. There's not a lot of humanity or I guess being a good leader from him when it was required.
I think in a world where social media is as it is and everyone is using it in a very different way, I think, to when the last time something like this similar happened, I don't think we live in a world where we can be economic with information. I think people probably need as much information as soon as possible, or we get these information vacuums and all of these wild conspiracy theories start popping up, whether it's with the Southport attacks, whether it's with Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales. In this era, if you are not giving the public the information, or at least a skeleton of the facts and the information, and they believe it, you're going to get all of these wild conspiracy theories, and then really bad things can happen, as we saw with the race riots last summer.
Also, what also happens, not just on social media, but you also end up with a situation where reporters are scrambling to try and find out information, and that's how you ended up with that absurd news report. And you sort of end up with an old photograph from years ago where he looks like a very, the perpetrator looks very young, but also some of the news reports saying, "Oh my God, he was a choir boy. He was a quiet, lovely choir boy." And again, that's also filling a vacuum.
He wasn't.
Yeah,
it was filling an information vacuum.
And that makes people angry. People look at that and say, well, hang on, this is the person that we know has just gone and allegedly, but it's pretty obvious, gone and killed all these people. And now we're having to read reports because there's nothing else out there telling us what a lovely boy he is. I can see why people get infuriated. And at that point, you're right. We either need information, or I would say we need leaders that know how to get the balance right of reassuring people. And I don't feel like we got either. Now, talking of information, just before we finish, where is it? I've always got it on hand, Albie. It's
A
always
little
here.
hand.
My copy of Spare.
Oh,
Always. I never leave home without it. I cherish it. Got all my post-its on it from where I had to review it on air.
gosh.
It often comes out, the copy of
How many
Spare.
times have you read that, Cristo?
And my favourite part is, of course, the part where he talks about having put Elizabeth Arden cream on his penis and his todger, as he calls it. But also, let's not forget in this book, there are countless examples of his brother's privacy being invaded, as well as other members of the family. In fact, he talks about when he went in to see the Queen, late Queen Elizabeth II, went to visit her lying, unfortunately, after she'd passed away. It opens with intimate details of a meeting that he had with the then Prince Charles and his brother after Prince Philip's funeral. So there are lots of what you could call invasions of privacy in this book. So, of course, that takes us to what happened in the last few hours, which is an unreserved apology by the Sun and the group of newspapers that the Sun runs for this apparent criminal behaviour, putting private detectives on him, all of this kind of behaviour. And Prince Harry looks like he's going to be accepting an exceedingly high sum of money, along with, what's the name of the politician that's also getting some money?
Tom Watson,
Lord Watson, as well, who went through something similar. So my question is, firstly, are you surprised to hear this unreserved apology? Secondly, should Harry have just gone to court? And thirdly, is he a hypocrite for not going to court when he said he would, but also, being such a trailblazer for a lack of invasion of privacy when he wrote a book doing just that?
to answer the last question first, I think there is a huge difference between a public figure essentially writing an autobiography and that being sold and millions of people buying it, something which many people do, and I'm glad they do it. I personally found the book very interesting, although there were parts where I thought it was a bit self-indulgent. It's something that lots of people do. Who knows, Chris? So maybe you'll write an autobiography one day and say something that I didn't want to be public. Who knows what's going to happen? But it's your right to do that, and you would have done that in a way which wasn't illegal.
Is
Prince
this the
Harry,
LGBT party again that you don't want?
yeah,
that
it might be that. It could be. It could be anything, Chris. We've known each other for such a long time now. There's so much that's happened, but. We'll leave that for both of our autobiographies, and the listeners will just have to stay alive that long in order to read them, because it might be a while. But of course, that information would all be gathered legally. And what Prince Harry's gripe is, it's not necessarily about the privacy. I think it's more about the way that the information was gathered, and that it was a breach of him as a child. A lot of the time, of course, there's a lot of probably trauma linked to his mother's death along with the press. And there's information that he believes has been gathered by legal means. Now, does that mean he should have gone to trial? Possibly. Maybe he's at a point in his financials with Meghan where he's thinking, actually, I could do with the money. That's up to him. But I don't not like him because he's brought this claim against a newspaper group that invaded his privacy in this way, whilst at the same time writing an autobiography, which of course is going to be about things that he's been through in his life, but on his terms.
Yes, but that I think I absolutely agree. By the way, criminal activity it's unforgivable, and I do have some admiration for him for standing up to that, and also I have some admiration for the Sun actually holding their hands up and going, you know what?
Yeah,
we have to admit we got it wrong, and I think that's fair play on both sides for that. But yeah, something sits uncomfortably with me because you're quite right. He could write an autobiography, but did he need to put in details about his brother's foreskin? I mean, really, did he need to put that in? You know, in what world is that acceptable when he is now sort of creating this image of someone who is concerned about people's privacy and concerned about his privacy? Now, you're right. There is a distinction between it being gathered lawfully and unlawfully, but the principle of privacy surely still remains somewhat. And it sort of goes to their endeavours about let's make the online world a nicer place. Well, some of their supporters are some of the most vile people online that you'll ever encounter. And so it's sort of, I think Harry has got to start practicing what he preaches. And the biggest issue I have with them as a couple, if Harry and Meghan hadn't put themselves out there constantly with autobiographies, with books, with deals in which they want to make money, I would have far more respect for Harry than going after the press and saying, look, you acted unlawfully. That doesn't forgive the press for acting unlawfully, but it's this, I just find them hypocritical. We want privacy, but we'll invade other people's. We're going to go after places that have got information about us that they shouldn't, but will reveal information about other people. Not unlawfully, but we still will. We don't want to end up with this intrusion into our lives, but we'll do a Netflix show and all of these sorts of things. We want online to be a kind place, but all of our supporters, many of them, are absolutely vile online and go after others and also troll the Princess of Wales while she's got cancer treatment. All of those things are double standards, and I think that it has to be pointed out, surely.
I think it does have to be pointed out, but I also wonder if we're thinking about this all a little bit too deeply, especially when it comes to some of the things that Prince Harry revealed about his family and his brother in the book Spare. I mean, if your sibling had really pissed you off, you might want to do something to piss them off in return. And Prince Harry just has a way to do that on a scale which is completely different to how I might irritate my sister if she'd irritated me, or a sibling of yours had irritated you. And I think he's possibly just using what he can in order to do things that normal people do day in and day out. But of course, with him, it's in a best-selling book and all of this media stuff. And with us, it might be something like not leaving the toilet seat down.
Well, yes, but then you don't. You know, if I was annoyed with my brother for not leaving the toilet seat where it should be, I wouldn't then paint myself as the arbiter of toilet seats. Do you know what I mean? It's that's what I can't quite get my head around. And I mean, maybe this is a bit different because he's exposing this unlawful behaviour, and I think that maybe that does give it more credence than some of his other endeavours where there has been some hypocrisy. But there is still a sprinkling of hypocrisy nonetheless. Now we come to an end, Albie.
We do, Cristo. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on. Now, as always, if you would like to subscribe, please do. If you want to comment, please do. I haven't replied to any of the comments from last week when we had Matt Blinsky on. I should have done. I haven't. But do comment, do like, do subscribe, do what else do people need to do? You're young, Albie. What else do people need to do? Share. You can share.
Like,
what else?
Comment, subscribe. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Also, Cristo, you don't say it often enough. You need to say it more. You need to say it like every 5 minutes to remind people.
Like and subscribe and share. Like and subscribe. Oh, you're right. Because
don't
actually,
forget to like and subscribe.
People only watch for like 10 minutes sometimes.
Yeah.
I haven't said it in that 10 minutes. They might not remember to.
You've only said it twice, Cristo. It's all right. You get it.
I need you, Albie. I need you to be my tunnel to youth.
Did you say tongue to youth?
Tunnel.
I was about to say. I'm not sure
how old are you, Albie?
I'm 31 now, so I'm not even that young.
Oh God, yes. Oh God, I've been looking in the wrong place if I want a tunnel to youth, aren't I then, dear? Listen, lovely to have you. Thank you. And once again, do like and subscribe. I've said it again now. There you go. That's 3 times, Albie. And I'll be back very soon next week for another episode of Cristo Putting the World Right. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Right here.